the whole thing, but I'd love to do it.
Yeah, all right. So because of her now, we're going to be book number. What is it for me? Book number 6. Hello, Mr. Farnham.
How are you?
And here's Joey and Seth. And Jan better come because he asked one of his Jan questions. He asks questions I can never follow what he's saying. Because it's like, I think the stream consciousness of his brain doesn't translate into, ironically, into words.
Maybe he's an AI.
Yeah, he might be. He might be. Well, you are here with the master class himself, Mr. Richard Owen. You guys want to introduce yourselves or say hi?
Go ahead,
Or just
Rob.
ask a question. They're afraid of you, Richard.
Jeez.
It's the haircut.
Hey, Richard, my name is Joey. Thanks a lot for your time. I appreciate listening to everything you said. I worked on a documentary in 2012 about exactly what you talked about. It's called The Naked Brand. And we interviewed leaders like Yvon Chouinard and Tony Hsieh, Keith Weed from Unilever, all about social responsibility and how it works. And I drank the Kool-Aid after shooting the documentary and went out and worked for 3 scientists who started a company that wanted to connect sustainable businesses with a conscious consumer population. We spent 3 years trying to do that, millions of dollars. And yeah, it doesn't work. So as someone who's actually been on the other side attempting to do it, I'd love to hear what you said, because now I have a consulting firm and I've been talking to clients about that exact thing. It's not, if your product has something to do with that, awesome. But if you're trying to recalibrate everything for the purpose of morals or purpose or anything else, and I use the same exact line, corporations today have 2 huge reports, the shareholders and the board, and they have a legal obligation to make money. There's no ethics involved in corporations. If they want to do ethical things, if they want to do moral things, awesome. It's a gift with purchase. If not, get over it and don't buy their stuff. So I was just awesome to hear you.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the conversation, I feel like on this topic, is a bit naive when it comes to understanding how companies actually focus. To your point,
yeah,
right? I think that you're not going to. And by the way, companies focus that way for some very, very good reasons, right? There's some really bad things happen when you actually tell leaders in corporations, you know what, just sort of define your own objectives. Because what they'll do is their own objectives will involve paying themselves lots and lots of money, even more perhaps than they make today, and leading cushy lives and not actually serving any audience.
Right.
Profitability focus is a good thing. The challenge is we have socially undesirable outcomes that we've got to find ways to adjust for. And I have a little concern that expecting business to solve this without the government is a very ambitious thing. I think that at the end of the day, in our society, government's there in some ways to change the rules of the game so that the game gets played in a beneficial way. And unfortunately, real change comes through the ballot box in societies like ours.
Yeah, no,
I was going to say, we didn't go down that path, and it wasn't because I didn't want to. I mean, I did. We can now, but it's, I've always erred personally just on the side of self-regulate, otherwise you'll get regulated. And can we trust dysfunctional government, or can we trust governments in general? And I'll tell you, it's very funny, because I was on a flight to South by Southwest last year. 2 things that don't happen anymore: flying and South by Southwest. And in front of me in coach, I was in the emergency exit because I used my status. Maybe she was in the other emergency exit too, was this woman by the name of Elizabeth Warren. Maybe you've heard of her. And so I don't know, because it's going to be online now, so I'm divulging trade secrets. So I do what I always do, which is the ultimate politician myself, is I said, I'm definitely voting for you. Wasn't planning on it. And I got a selfie because, in fact, her whole selfie trend started with me, little known fact. And Get it. And but you know, she proceeded. So two things were going on, which was hysterical. One is she was writing her speech about, I think, breaking up Amazon, and she should have probably put a screen protector on because I was like peering through the seat back. But she was amazing, very articulate, very engaging, very charismatic, very smart. And when she actually explained about breaking up Amazon, it actually made sense to me. And I was so conflicted because it actually made sense. And it's funny because listening to I think it was Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher, they were saying there's only one person right now that's capable of figuring some, you know, certain things out, and that's her. But it's interesting because it's like, this is my love-hate relationship with government.
Well, I think the politicians always suffer from, no matter how good your ideas are, you're stuck with the reality of how your constituencies want you to direct, right? And so good ideas often, you know, get lost and get wrapped up in the politics. But to your point about breaking up Amazon, I think that if you're a full-throated capitalist, you're generally anti-monopolistic, because capitalism works less and less effectively with more and more concentration of business. And so I think that associating capitalism with monopolies and concentration of business and sort of fat cats and Rockefeller, and we've got this sort of, you know, we're going back to this era where the grand barons of business run the universe, is completely misdirected. Markets are good. Markets solve these problems. To your point, you'll just see the weak die and the strong. It's very Darwinistic. What gets in the way of all that happening is too much concentration of business. And we have a structure for that. We have government regulations which recognize the public interest is well served by maintaining competition and low concentration of business. Now, you'd argue that government's the ultimate monopoly, which is one of the reasons why most government services aren't that great. But what government can do is work aggressively to avoid monopolies occurring, not even if they're unfairly earned. I don't think Amazon dishonestly created its market share any more than Facebook dishonestly created its market share. Full, you know, round of applause to them. Congratulations, guys. But at some point, our interest as a society and as an economy is not well served by having that kind of concentration of industry strength. And so, you know, great, you guys, you made your money, round of applause. But for the best thing in capitalism we can do is we can split you up and say, it's time to force competition. And the counter argument, by the way, is in technology industries, there's so much competitive pressure, this happens almost inevitably. So you know, if you look back, leaders typically get broken up anyway. The question is, does it happen fast enough? Is too much damage done in the interim? So it's a debate. But I think that this notion that there's so much power concentrated economically in a smaller number of companies is not a healthy thing for democracy.
I mean, I think that statement you made is it's a money one. I mean, literally and figuratively, this idea that if you're a true capitalist, then you cannot be in favor of monopolies. But there were two things that I just wanted to say about Amazon. One is, so I've always, there are two aspects or three practices in terms of their practices. One is early on into COVID, Amazon not really taking care of its employees and applying a certain level of rigor of hygiene and safety. That was point number one. Point number two, and I'll get to like the ultimate one. Point number two is, I think the big concern, and this is something that Elizabeth Warren was uncovering, she almost, you know, it's as if you're saying it to your grandmother, and she must have looked at me that way, and then I understood it. But it was this idea that you've got these mom and pops and these small players and these merchants that are creating some kind of a product or a value prop, and they're rising and growing. And Amazon just looks at all the data, and then they come out with their own version of it and essentially kill them and throttle them. And I think that's been the biggest concern, or that made sense to me. That doesn't need to be a part of their business. But on the flip side, you know what? They're a flippin' unbelievable company, and let them grow and let them do whatever they want, because
Look, I mean,
no one can.
that's competition, isn't it? Right? I mean, complaining that they beat up on the competitors, that's what competition is. I mean, stretching our regular metaphor, it's a bit like saying, you know, you shouldn't play too aggressively against the other footy team because you might win by too many points, right? You know, it's competition. And I hear a couple of statements that never make much sense to me. Amazon should pay their fair share of taxes. Well, Amazon doesn't determine how much tax they pay, right? In fact, they're under an obligation to minimize taxes they pay. They don't, as long as they don't break the law, they're paying their fair share. Government decides how much taxes they should pay. So complaining that Amazon doesn't pay their fair share is just silly. They're paying what you tell them to pay. Same as citizens, you know, not too many citizens say, well, I'm going to write an extra check to the IRS. I think I underpay my taxes. Secondly, expecting companies not to beat up on their competition seems to misunderstand the meaning of the word competition, right? So I saw a piece the other day, it's like Facebook aggressively tried to squash competitors, right? Insert the name of any company on the planet there. Well, of course, the fact is what we're really complaining about is they were too good at it. So we're not trying to squash competition. We're not trying to berate companies for following the law. All that is just theatrics and frankly a distraction. But we can recognize that the tenets that make capitalism strong, that make markets strong, break down when you get too much concentration of power. And so that's a reasonable market failure, if you like, for governments to say, wait a second, this is where markets aren't working. Let's step in and let's take a look at it and determine whether the best interests are well served. Look, we just saw a consolidation in the telco industry in this country again. And a former colleague of mine, John Ledger, over at T-Mobile, strong evangelist for T-Mobile and Sprint getting together because it's in the customer interest. Now, I'm no expert on 5G economies of scale, but certainly my antenna goes up when you hear about business leaders saying consumers will benefit from a compression of competition. That's not my default assumption. My default assumption is you have fewer choices. You're probably going to see less competition. But on the other hand, these companies see competition from competitive alternatives all the time. So it might be that Google gets into the business, and that's really where competition comes from. My point is simply this. To the degree that we can harness the power of competitive markets of capitalism, we'll get a lot of change. To the degree that we are pushing against that, we're going to find that it's just very hard to move things, and society moves very slowly.
I think a good example of that is the success of SpaceX, you know, where they're brought in basically in a bid, and their goal is to accomplish the same mission that NASA had at a more efficient price. And they did it by more than 20x negative. They innovated by creating technology that allowed the booster rocket to re-land instead of crash and burning up all that capital. So, you know, yeah.
No, I think it's a great example. And, you know, you're pretty familiar, Peter Diamandis created the X Prize, and the X Prize was the original competition to find a reusable space shuttle. And you know, guys like Burt Rutan, who was a famous designer, you know, was one of the big competitors. And then Richard Branson very astutely waited to see who won and bought the winner. And that became Virgin Galactic, right? Because he's a smart businessman. Diamandis' theory is that human ingenuity knows no bounds. And if you create enough competition for ideas, somebody will come up with a much better way of doing anything. You pick any problem. I mean, what are we betting on right now? Where is the solution for COVID-19 going to come from, right? It's going to come from one of thousands of entrepreneurs and scientists around the world who are scrambling to find a solution. Somebody's going to come up with an answer. I'm extremely optimistic, not because any one person is so brilliant, but because so many people are so collectively motivated to solve the problem that amongst all those innovators, someone will break through. Maybe many people will break through. We might have 4 or 5 great solutions, as in fact, the X Prize illustrated. It wasn't just one guy who figured out how to build a returnable space shuttle. Many ideas came forward.
Yeah. But I think that the complication seems to come in when you have success, not by the company per se, and the innovation that that company brings to the whole industry, which is a great thing. But when that success creates a very small pocket of wealth among a small, relatively, very relative, now, I mean, really small number of people,
right,
who do more to speak to the inequality than to do anything about it.
So it's a real dilemma, isn't it? If we gave people a choice and we said there's the choice of 2 possible systems, one in which a relatively small number of people accumulate vast riches, but society as a whole sees increases in standard of living, sees GDP increase, or a system where it's much more equitable, but it's equitable at a much lower level of improvement. Yeah. Which is the better answer? And it's on theory, it's a pretty simple answer, because you'd say, well, we'd much rather have, we'd deal with the fact that some people get mega rich if everyone gets lifted to a degree by that. We have faster GDP growth for the poorest in our society, right? That would be the answer we want. What we've seen is a bit of a challenge with that, right? It hasn't really worked the way we hoped. You look back over 20, 30 years, the average income for non-college educated, in fact, even for college educated people, compared to, say, advanced degrees, has flatlined. So the fact that we've been very successful as economies, we see real GDP growth, hasn't yet translated into sort of mass benefits for our society. Now, I don't think stymieing entrepreneurs or saying, Mark Zuckerberg, shouldn't be allowed, is a solution for the problem. I think it's a symptom of the problem, but we need Zuckerbergs, we need Jeff Bezos's, right? We need Elon Musk's, but we've still got to find a way to deal with this issue that as a society, we're not raising the bottom 5 or 10%. Now, the biggest single cause for that is likely globalization. The unfortunate reality is, and look, I've been in software industry for a long time. When I started in software in Silicon Valley, I had teams full of QA engineers sitting at desks testing software. Then all those jobs went to India, all of them. Yep. Then all those jobs got eliminated with automation, all of them, right? So you saw the low-end jobs destroyed by a combination of globalization and technology. And those are the macro problems we have. And we are struggling to find good solutions to rage against that trend. And most of the ideas mooted don't address the root cause problem, which is that if you're a graduate in computer science even today, coming out of a middling American university, your competition is some guy out of an Indian Institute of Technology who's willing to work for a fifth of what you get paid and is very good at their job. And that's our problem. And how does our society adjust to that? And I feel the biggest disappointment in my lifetime is that we've sort of squandered the opportunity to help our society adjust, right? This should be the national debate. Look, I mean, you're a coal miner in the Appalachians. We don't want you mining coal. It's not good for our society. But what else are you going to do? And how are we going to transition you? Because, there's this term, let them eat coal. I think you might have heard that one, which is a sort of Marie Antoinette, sort of almost arrogance of the new global technological tribe saying, well, coal miners in the Appalachian, they don't matter. It's a bad industry. But why is it bad? I mean, we've got to do something for these people, right? We can't relegate them and their heirs to, no economic future just because we recognize it's not great to have coal in our society. So we're doing a very poor job as a society of transitioning our most vulnerable through an inevitable economic change. And we can't rage against the economic change, it's happening. But what we should be doing is figuring out how to transition people through that. And there's almost no national debate about it. It's not even a discussion. right? You've got one group saying, well, let's protect coal miners, let's bring coal back. And the other group saying, we don't need coal, let's shut it all down. And the question should be, how do we help us get off that coal production into another form of production, and how do we take care of those people through the transition? That's our challenge.
I want to say two things, complete non sequiturs, maybe the first isn't, but yesterday I went to, now that we're starting to open up a little bit, I went to pay condolences to a good friend of mine who lost his father, and the rabbi that was there said, what are the two sets of numbers on a tombstone? And the answer, of course, is
the date.
Right, the date.
Date of birth.
Date of birth and date of death. And he said,
but
he said, there's something else, isn't there? A little dash between. He said the dash is the most important part of the whole story, of their whole life, of the whole journey. All you have with those two dates is the start point and the end point, the two extremes in this case. And it makes me think about that coal analogy, Richard, which is, one extreme, the other extreme. But what about the dash? What about the process and the journey?
Right.
The other thing is just to say is you can, well, this is the first time Bob Farnham has ever put a hashtag into the Zoom after show. But can you imagine, guys, when I spoke about how Richard Owen opened up the conference, he's opening up this conference to a room filled with 700-800 people. Some of them are customer service managers, but he's able to tell his story, and this was your genius, with video, with photos, in a way that was just perfect for such a diverse audience with different seniorities, etc. And that's why I loved it so much, because you were able to communicate complex messages, but in a very inclusive, open, and relatable way.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I think what we're really short of is a good dialogue, right? I think at a time when we need to be encouraging dialogue, I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that I noticed, I'm trying to avoid politics to a degree here, but at the end of the last election, I know a lot of people were really shocked by the result. They were very surprised. And I think as a globalist, as a sort of guy who's lived his entire life I carry 2 passports, for goodness sake, right? I sort of, citizen of the world, and a technologist and a globalist. And realizing that there were many people in our society for whom everything that has benefited me has been a negative for them. Basically, at the end of the day, global competition, technological advances, they are on the wrong end of that. And I can say 2 things simultaneously. I can say that all of that, global competition, technological progress, is good for mankind. It is good for our society. And at the same time, say something else. It is selectively very bad for our society. And so until we start to acknowledge that we can't hold the rocket ship back, we can't sort of say, well, can you stop inventing new ideas? Can we somehow pretend that businesses aren't going to find new innovative ways to change things? Look, the single largest source of employment for high school educated people in North America is what job? Anyone want to guess?
Restaurant.
Number 2, supermarket checkout. Right? What's the over-under on supermarket checkout positions 20 years from now? We're about to eliminate thousands of jobs, which are some of the only ones available for high school educated people in this country. What on earth do we intend to do with them? And I don't think the answer, by the way, is send them all to university, because I think that's probably a very bad economic transaction for them. And we spend too much time telling kids who have no business going to university anyway to take on debt and go to university. What we need to figure out is what roles in society are going to be required, and how do we migrate our people through that. We're not going to hold the technology back. We're not going to tell Amazon, don't invent a more efficient checkout process. That's naive. But we do need to think about these transitions. Truck drivers, one of the biggest sources of employment growth over the last decade. What do you think Elon Musk, if Elon Musk's successful, what's going to happen to truck drivers? Right? I mean, autonomous vehicles.
So Richard, if it's so, that's well said. If it's so much more complicated and antithetical to expect a successful company to stop caring about making profits, and you can argue short-term versus long-term, that's another conversation.
Yeah.
Then why not at least create guardrails for that company to have an equation for the thing it's replacing? So if you innovate, and within that innovation, it's understood through data, it's going to replace X number of people and capital, you have to solve that innovatively as well.
So before you answer, I am going to, we're still loose enough, Richard, that we can mix things up. I have to just take a 10 or 15 minute, maybe less time out, but I'm gonna leave you guys to continue. And then, you know, if you're gone when I come back, so be it. But I just want to say a few things. One, Richard, thank you again for your time. And we're going to catch up anyway offline. Second of all, this Zoom after show is live. I mean, we do it every day right after the show, and then I post the whole conversation as it is. And you are welcome to come to it any day you want. And I always say, my little self-deprecating way of saying it is, don't come for me, just look at the guest. And if the guest seems interesting, come back. But these days, you know, come back for Jan, maybe. Although I think he just walked out of this. He was upset about the fact that I'm leaving. So Jan, are you there?
Thank you so much for the invitation. This has been.
Oh, he is there. All right. So if you want, no, it was fantastic. And I mean, you know, just my head is hurting because now I realize how you were dumbing down those presentations. And I realized, I thought it was for them, the other people, but I realized it was for me. So I was like, I don't even understand half the things he's saying. He's too smart. But maybe I'll be back, but I'll just leave it going here for you guys.
Thanks, Joseph. So
thank you, Joseph.
So on your point about guardrails, I think that you're right. We need to be thinking about this. I think that there are a couple of mechanisms to solve that problem. The one argument is you should say, okay, we essentially have to use tax as a mechanism. We have to reflect the full social cost of what companies do. And there's lots of sound economic theory behind that, right? We tax externalities generally. If you pollute, we tax it, it's an externality. So you could argue that any societal ill effect should be, that's undervalued in the P&L of the company, should be addressed through taxation. It's a proven mechanism. It does kind of fly against global competition though. If I'm competing against a Chinese company that doesn't have that handicap, I'm going to lose. The other way to do it, of course, is to see that government's role is to mitigate the negative effects of capitalism. So yes, tax is one option. Yes, government involvement is. See, I'm not an interventionist from government in general. I'm very skeptical about government's effectivity. But I do recognize that we have to have an ability to intervene in market inefficiencies. And so what we need is an effective government intervention. And too often we seem to be in this debate, which it's government needs to be very heavy-handed, over-interventionist, or it needs to just get out of my business, get out of my face. And we're struggling, and I think it's a product of the political environment, to be surgical about government's role instead of being heavy-handed. So I think the guardrails are provided by government. The rules of the game, they're the referees. They can set the rules, but they can also mitigate the economic effects. And centrally planned economies have done this actually arguably very well over the years. I mean, the China's, even a capitalist economy like Singapore, which is, you know, more centrally planned than the States, or even Germany, these countries have had better industrial policy than the United States. I think they've made mistakes. I think, for example, right now, Europe decided last week that they're going to build, a competitive infrastructure to beat Amazon Web Services, right? It's vital that Europe has its own AWS equivalent, right? Now, this is ridiculous idea. First of all, that might have been an interesting decision a decade ago. They're way behind the curve. Secondly, what makes them think that they need that? It's not obviously that's the battleground. And so it's a good example of how government tends to be too late, misdirected, and someone's going to get rich off the back of that, and it's going to have very little to do with merit. But instead, maybe our interesting question should be, if we're looking at technologies we know are going to eliminate jobs, how do we direct society's efforts somehow to find innovative ideas to pull them up? And that I think is going to be the challenge for our entire generation, because technology is job destructive, period. I mean, most of technology is designed to make things more efficient. And we're getting very good at technology. We're not getting any worse at this. Think about, I know AI is absurd at some level because everyone imagines that it's, it's going to be flying cars and, robots that look like humans. But we are essentially taking human processes in white collar jobs, which are mostly around some fairly simple processes and thinking, and we're starting to automate them using more advanced algorithms. So this is white collar jobs. This is the next wave of, oops, there goes your job. I don't know whether any of you have seen those posters. They were a bit of a parody of motivational posters. It was a company called Despair Inc. used to make these still does, very funny. And I remember one of their posters was, if you ever have a job that can be easily done by a computer, pretty soon you'll be out of that job. Was paraphrasing. And now computers are getting better, so that threshold is changing. So, Jan, I don't have any simple answers, but what I would say this is we haven't even started having a conversation. And it would be useful if we could have the conversation. You've heard of Bill Gross, right? Bill Gross was probably one of the most successful bond in PIMCO in his day. Yeah. And he wrote a fabulous letter to investors. It's probably about 2 or 3 years ago, completely out of character, where he basically said, the dominant issue that should preoccupy our politicians is how to transition our society as we go through waves of innovation. And he wrote a wonderfully articulate letter about this, and basically said, this is the national debate we should be having, but nobody's even talking about it. And instead we're arguing about, you see what we're arguing about. And so we're not even starting to talk about interesting ideas. We're either King Canute sitting there saying, we'll direct the waves to cease because we're all powerful, or we're basically saying, hey, I've got a boat, hell with everyone else.
That's great. No, I think that's fantastic. I think the funny part, you mentioned the grocery stores, because I actually wrote about that recently, because they came up. I've been in digital for a long time in the advertising side, and they became very powerful, and they spent billions of dollars of investment in that in the early aughts. And I don't know exactly how that's going to change, but boy, the public hated them, right? So it didn't work here in America at all. And I actually wrote about, I think, Jan, you even read that piece, but it was one of those things where I just laughed out loud, because it was when I used to be a bagger in college. So it's when you have, a broken egg, or if you have a milk that's leaking, or, can I carry these groceries to your car for you, ma'am? It was so much customer service that they were offended that, okay, so you want me to check out, and number one, people can't figure out an ATM. So the bottom line is it took a while for people to figure out an ATM. How do I get my own money out of this thing? But it proved to be less cumbersome. When you have a bunch of stuff that doesn't scan, or you don't understand how it works, or you hit the wrong button. And so that piece of technology, I think, is debatable. The bigger piece that I was working on was that in America, we have approximately 4 million long-haul truck drivers that will be actually replaced by technology. We have 4.7 million Uber and Lyft drivers, right? And if you look at some of the numbers around historical norms around things like NAFTA, we lost 1 million manufacturing jobs in a period of 20 years, right? We're talking about 10 million just within the numbers that I mentioned. And that's not including what you talked about with AI and coming in and taking away some of the jobs, even like lower level lawyering, low level accounting, low level, like those jobs are gone too. So now you're looking at mass unemployment. And then our government, specifically here, is still fighting over metaphor and still fighting over like tribalism. And so, you know, Confucius always talked about the one thing we can talk about if your plan is for 100 years, educate children, right? That was the end. And that is our biggest problem today, is if you look at what's happening in the United States, whether you sit on either side, we're about to have massive layoffs in government work, policemen, firemen, teachers. And I have 2 little boys in school right now, and I'm getting these updates weekly from our superintendent that they may not open schools, not just because of COVID, but because they don't have the budget. And they don't have the budgets to actually implement what needs to take place with school. So you need to clean the schools. You need masks for these little kids who have no money. You need to be able to feed these kids that we're not feeding while we have these kids out of school. You know, my little kids are in the dining room with their Apple laptops, you know, doing their homework. And for half their school, or because they go to a very diverse school, doesn't have access to those things, right? They don't have computers. They don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have these pieces and parts. And it's just, that's the bigger scare for me, right? It's not just global capitalism. It's how is this all going to affect?
Well, and to your point, look, you know, I hate to pour on sort of the anxiety, but we're coming off an amazing period of success from an economic perspective, right? We had the best of times, and you know, a 10-year run of record low unemployment for the size of our economy, some pretty decent GDP growth numbers. You know, 2% GDP growth is pretty good for an economy our size. We've certainly no indication we're going to be able to do any better than that.
Yeah.
And during these great years, we struggled to raise low-level employee salaries, and we struggled to find ways to fund the social infrastructure of our country during the best years. And now, quite possibly, we're entering into a period when we're going to face fundamental economic challenges. We're certainly going to in the short term, but it could easily turn into some long-term issues. And that's got all sorts of ripple and negative. We may look back at the last few years and go, wow, those were the best of times. So we're facing some formidable challenges. And I think the most disturbing disconnect for me is how growth has not translated into a better society or a more resilient society in the way we hoped it would have done. Now, there's no alternative to growth, by the way. I mean, I don't think that the right answer is to say, oh, heck with this whole capitalism thing and growth. Let's abandon it and let's just sort of, you know, tear down the barricades and distribute all the money, because I don't think that's going to work. I think animal spirits, capitalism, entrepreneurialism is what works, but it's not working well enough. So what happens if the best possible approach isn't good enough? And that becomes a hard problem to solve.
Well, some would argue that the phrase "it's not working well enough" could be replaced by "it's not working."
I mean, I think that's exactly fine, right? At some point, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, I think you're absolutely right. If at the end of the day it's working insufficiently for society, who's the ultimate customer.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about capitalism. You talked about capitalism needing that spread of market, and it's a short-term gain with a long-term disaster. And I think there are some capitalists who are speaking up about that, and it's that need, and maybe that's where government comes in to stop this short-term vision of business and reward long-term.
Well, the short-term, long-term, and I know you raised this, Jan, as a question. I think it's an interesting one, right? On one hand, you have public markets making Tesla the most valuable car company in the world. So clearly, totally unconcerned with short-term profits. literally saying, and, a new company, Nikola, has never shipped a vehicle and it's worth more than Ford Motor Company. So accusing markets of being myopic about short-term profits, in some instances, they're clearly completely opposite. And I actually find that when you talk to leaders or boards, more relevantly, in large corporations, they're far less concerned about short-term profitability than the sort of stereotype. They understand their job is to build multi-year plans. They understand it takes time to get things in place. I'm far more optimistic about that. I think it's a bit of a popular narrative looking at, profits move up and down, because when people say profits and announce them quarterly, everyone thinks, well, that's your obsession. I think that's a scorecard, but over the long term, it's clear the market's been ready to be very patient with businesses over long-term growth periods. Doesn't mean, by the way, that we're solving long-term societal problems in doing it. Look, my own view on equality of outcomes, so the fact that the rich get richer, the poor aren't getting any richer, is that it's destabilizing for our society. And I hate to make it sound sterile and somehow it's not about people, but at some level it destabilizes our society. It's a poor societal outcome. The challenge I have is that most of the ideas to address it generally make things worse. That actually is the issue. We don't see thoughtful and clever ideas coming forward that, to me, sound like they're going to work, right? Transferring wealth generally removes incentives and creates as many problems as it solves. Now, I would argue, and I'm definitely in Bill Gates' camp on this, I think intergenerational wealth transfer is a big problem. I think that the idea that we create dynasties and we hand large sums of money over to our offspring creates societal structural problems over time, because that's unearned wealth. And, I think that destabilizes society. And, in England, where I grew up, we've been doing that a lot longer than the Americans have. And
gotta go, boy.
See you. And I think that's resulted in destabilization. So I don't think it's, but I don't, at the same time, I think we have to encourage people to build wealth, but we have to encourage people to sort of, let's put a finer point on it, take it to the grave with them. It's kind of like, hand it over. You're done. You had a good run. You enjoyed it. You had your yachts, your jets, whatever you did, you had your fun. That's terrific. By the way, we taxed you on it. So it wasn't like we didn't take our pound of flesh. But what we don't want you to do is bequeath it to a new Uber class that's going to come up and represent sort of passive gains on equity in our society. We need that money back into circulation.
Those are all great points. I think we have a big experiment going on right now with the pandemic and capitalism on which country comes up with the vaccine that works and how that's going to be executed. If it becomes a free market competitive bid, it's going to drive us back into exactly the kind of mentality that is not good for the world.
Beggar thy neighbor. Now I'm actually very optimistic about that, but not for governmental reasons. I think that if you look at the large pharma companies that are doing this, first of all, they're multinationals with strong interest in maintaining their brand, right? So if you take AstraZeneca as a good example, probably one of the foremost companies focused on this. Most of their research is out the UK. A lot of their funding is coming from the US. Their employees are in the UK. I think the odds that if AstraZeneca comes up, and by the way, they've already said they'll distribute the virus a vaccine at cost. So they've kind of committed up front to say it won't be a profitable venture for them. I think the odds that they turn around and say, oh, you know what, we're gonna take care of everyone in the US, but forget about Africa. I don't think the intent of the corporations will be to do that. It would destroy their brands. It would destroy their employee. They destroy their franchise as a business. Now, will governments intervene to create problems? That's a whole other matter. But I think actually corporations, ironically, will do the right thing because look, the bragging rights are worth, billions.
Yeah, I guess I'm pessimistic or cynical, I should say, not pessimistic. It's got a little bit better because of the precedent of maybe it's not a precedent, maybe it's going all over the world where a president, head of state like Trump, calls in private companies, which sounds like a great idea. I'm all for that, but might be, putting some pressure, or for sure putting some pressure on those companies, or giving them carrots if they do come around to be the winner, that would then not serve the greater good.
I think it's a legitimate concern, of course. I think that there's enough transparency here that I would hope that that won't happen. Somebody once asked me, what if it's the Chinese come up with the answer first? I say that then you will have press photographs of Chinese scientists in every European and American city gleefully handing over Huawei branded boxes of vaccines.
Well, and China becomes its own brand for its own.
Saying, here, this just goes to show how China's system is the best in the world. The Chinese will be tripping over themselves to demonstrate that their superiority of their system. So I actually think we're not gonna, we're gonna have, it's interesting to see how it plays out, but I think there's a lot of anti-parochial drivers. Mm-hmm. And I also think even politically, right? I mean, depending on how cynical you are or pro or con current administration in the States, I think the American public is not going to support the idea of discriminatory distribution of vaccines. I don't think that flies with the American ethic. I'd like to think that's true. I became a naturalized American citizen because I love the idea of America, as much as anyone. And I'd like to think as a nation, we wouldn't support that because that's, in my mind, personally, very un-American. And I think that will win out in the end. That's the source of my optimism. I think that actually multinationals have hearts, oddly enough. I think that populations do as well. And that gives me cause for optimism. Same as the entrepreneurs. My sister actually worked, headed a lot of clinical trials for AstraZeneca for a long time. She's an expert in the clinical trial space. And these people who are working on vaccines are incredibly motivated, not by profit. I mean, that's not what gets them out of bed in the morning. They want a cure, first and foremost, because that's their reason for their existence. They want to serve humanity. Secondly, and let's be honest about it, is because, to Joseph's point earlier, they want their bust in the entrance to the Natural History Museum as the person who, Madame Curie.
Yeah, well, that's the good side of the free market, and each country is its own, brand. So,
all right, I've muted Jen. I'm a total abuse of power, complete abuse of power.
Wait.
Oh wait, he unmuted himself.
I did. So Richard, I think you and Joseph have something here in the net promoter score, and just change the net to nation.
Yeah, now that's a very cool idea.
All right, I'm glad you unmuted yourself again.
There you go. That's a great.
All right, I'm going to unmute him. I'm going to officially unmute him now. After that, the nation.
Guys, I do have to go, but Joseph, can I just say finally again, look, I enjoyed this immensely. I was so glad you invited me to do this, and I think what you're doing is spectacular. And watching the mechanics of this whole thing, I am utterly in awe at bringing this up. And of course, the best thing that's happened is, just as you've built this media empire here, burgeoning media empire, every other media business has kind of devolved into Wayne's World. And so they've kind of been coming right down in production standards. You've been coming right up in production standards. And at this point, you're on the par with the very best of them. So I think that it's the absolute perfect timing for this. So congratulations again. And guys, all of you, thank you so much for joining and support for this endeavor. It's super excited. And Joseph, only 2 games required now to clinch the
Wait, you muted yourself? Thank you. I didn't even do that to you. I love that effect. And all I can say is, hey, Steve Garfield, you know, you tell Jimmy Fallon to suck it. Just kidding. Um, uh, guys, I will see you guys tomorrow. Some of you, Richard, I'll be in touch. Thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Means a lot to me.
When smart people say nice things about you, that's pretty cool.
That was very special.